Today is Thursday, February 27th, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host and partner, Mr. Wallace Smith. But Mr. Smith, we also have a special guest today. Could you introduce our special guest?
We do have a special guest, and he's been very patient as it's taken us approximately 14 hours to get the microphones working and everything. We have the pastor of the Charlotte congregation, Mr. John Strain. Do you want to say hi, Mr. Strain?
Good afternoon. Glad to be here.
Thank you. All right. I was going to ask you what our topic is today.
Yes. The reason we asked Mr. Strain onto this podcast is we wanted to tackle the topic of what does it mean to be a minister, and especially a field minister in particular.
Yeah, a little behind the scenes.
That's right, behind the scenes.
Thank you, Jake and Julia. We appreciate that. And welcome again to the Living Youth Podcast. And for the topic today, we really did think it would be helpful to all of you out there to understand just a little bit behind the scenes, kind of parting the curtain a bit in terms of what are the duties of a minister. What is a minister who's actually running a congregation, all the work that they do. Sometimes you may see them for a long stretch just behind the lectern, giving a fantastic sermon, of course, and then wonder, well, do they just, they go take a cruise
for the rest of the week? They just sit in their easy chair.
That's right. Eat Fruit Loops and, watch cartoons, and they show up again, for the Sabbath. Right. So we thought it would be good to actually have a real live. I mean, I know we're ministers, but at the same time, we're not pastoring congregations. We're not doing that anymore. We're working in a different capacity. And I want to give credit to Mr. Robinson and let him perhaps talk about why he thought about this, because this actually was Mr. Robinson's idea.
Well, growing up in the church, we've talked about that many times. As a little kid, I remember, I think fairly young, being fascinated by the order of services. And, and back in worldwide, the church congregations could be very large. So you had a lot of men serving. Some men were ushering. Some men were deacons. And one of the things that always fascinated me was if one man who clearly was in some kind of official capacity came over and talked to maybe the minister or another deacon and whispered in his ear. I wanted to know what amazing top secret information was being passed along. And so you see all these men working to keep services running, and then and guys giving sermonettes, but then the minister comes up and gives the sermon, and of course naturally that's the most fascinating of all the roles. And ministers, they come in and give sermons.
It's very visible.
That's right, very visible. But, growing up, and then eventually when friend of the podcast, Mr. Phil Senna, moved into our area, he started working with some of the younger men there, and younger can be relative, and I was one of them. And over time, as he showed me more and more kind of the inner workings of a minister's day-to-day life, I was actually blown away by how much work a minister does. And I think the analogy that really does work the best for it is the idea of an iceberg. I went and double-checked with our friend ChatGPT. He did confirm that, in fact, only 10% of the average iceberg is seen above the water. And
that or he made it up. It's possible.
I guess maybe it was a hallucination. I have heard in the past that most of the iceberg is below the water where you don't see it.
That is true, yeah.
And I found that to be very much the case with the ministers. In fact, so much so that I really was, I remember, epiphany's probably too strong, but I really do remember thinking, wow, a minister going up and giving the sermon is really, in some ways, the least of what he does. And I'm not minimizing the importance of a sermon. That's not my point.
Of course.
It's just all the work that goes in behind the scenes, in the background. And I'm here to tell you, the ministers are very, very active during the week, keeping things running. And we'll have a series of questions that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But one of the first
and thank you for being here, by the way. I don't know if we've actually thanked you yet, Mr. Strain. We should at least say thank you.
Maybe
put on good manners.
Mr. Strain could explain that he only has one congregation, but that keeps him pretty busy.
What's that like, pastoring here?
Well, this discussion is going to be primarily about being what it's like to be a field pastor. Obviously, I've done that in multiple locations. And headquarters, to use a common phrase, is a different animal of sorts. It's obviously a large congregation, and really the work associated for any one of us it really is based on the number of members in our congregations. And obviously we have upwards of 350, 70 people at headquarters, part of the congregation. So that says right there it's busy. But for a field minister, you have anywhere from ministers who have probably a minimum of 3, but some ministers have as many as 6 congregations or 7 congregations that they have to manage geographically. And so there's a lot more to it than just people. There's a lot involved in terms of travel and their schedules and managing all of the facilities that are involved. So it's a much bigger deal to have several churches, and you have to coordinate. So there's a lot more travel than what I would experience at headquarters. But I've been in other areas where I had multiple churches, and managing the travel and the coordination of the services is a much bigger deal and does take a lot of time.
There's definitely some differences. I was thinking about that the other day because I've had 2 different areas I pastored with multiple congregations in those. And in fact, some of you guys are listening. Hello, I still love all of you. But when I think of the number of people you're pastoring here in Charlotte, it's actually a larger. When I actually combine the numbers in my areas, I may have had to drive around to get to some of the congregations, but the number of people is actually larger here. It's a big congregation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a major difference because more people, the more members of a congregation means there's more people to know, and more situations that. In dealing with anointing, just for example, you get a lot more anointing requests out of 350 people, members, than you would in an area which, let's say, the aggregate is 150. So,
Right. So do you buy your olive oil at Costco then? So
yes, well, actually, I do have 2 locations where I could refill the bottle.
Oh,
and at home and at the office.
That's good. Well, in Charlotte, by having church headquarters here, throws in some challenges that the average field pastor would not deal with. Like twice a year, we have the Council of Elders, and all the ministers and the regional pastors come in from the other areas, and it's 3 or 4 days of meetings and conversation, and a winter weekend activity that I know requires quite a lot of organizing. So even beyond what you would do normally as a field pastor, there's other challenges associated with what what headquarters brings to the table.
yeah.
Yes, being in headquarters, that there are things that really are headquarters activities, not even involving the church in general, but headquarters responsibilities that you get pulled into. And it affects your schedule and the amount of time that is devoted to pastoring the church. If all I did was pastoring the church, life would be a lot simpler.
But we don't let you do that. Now, in terms of the pastoring the church, though, that's one of the aspects that was impressed upon me and is very different. When I was moved from the field to do an editorial job, it really was a kind of a shift because I was back to more of a 9 to 5 kind of job. That is, I'd drive to work and I would be here and then I'd go home. And generally, I say generally, I'm not hearing from, say, Mr. Robinson or Thomas White or William Williams or anyone saying, "Oh no, it's 2:00 in the morning and we have an editorial emergency. We've got to change this article." But that is different than it was back when I was in the field. You're kind of on call, right, in terms of in the ministry?
Well, yes, being on call is I say that's a one way of putting it. I think it's important for the pastor simply to be available. I know here at headquarters, I use my door. I leave it cracked. That means I'm in the office and I'm available. If it's closed, people then knock on the door, and if I answer, they know that they can come in. But at home, in the field, you get a phone call, and so they don't see you. They text you or they call you to see if you're available, and you do have unexpected calls. I won't say that they're all that frequent, but it's not uncommon to get a call late in the evening, early in the morning before you're up, and maybe you get in from visiting at 10 o'clock at night, and the call comes in at 5 o'clock, and you're really not up at 5 o'clock. If you get home at 10 and get to bed by 11:30, you may not be up at 5 o'clock. So there's some different obligations, but being available, be it by the phone or texting, and any special needs, that the congregation needs to know you are available and willing to do whatever needs to be done at any time.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. I that resonates with what I wish I had realized it earlier. Though even in with some of my training with Mr. Milich, I started to get more of a sense of it. That sometimes, would you really describe that as your job, in terms of sometimes your job is to represent the church and in being available? It's almost like that. Like I remember a situation I dealt with one situation in a hospital where it was really tragic. I won't go into it, but I realized there was kind of nothing for me to do. There was no anointing. It was, and sometimes you struggle on what to say, and often try to encourage people in this way, that sometimes it's not just a matter of saying something, it's just that you're present,
Yes.
just being there. And I started to realize that sometimes that actually is the pastor's job, is just to make sure that he's available and he's there. And so it sounds like that's kind of how part you would characterize the job, is your part of your job is being available.
I think it very much the case with the gentlemen that come in, the ministers that come in for some training. That's one of the things I explained, that there's an obligation to be accessible, readily available. I had just an example of I sort of had a rule. I don't think I've ever said it here at headquarters, but in the field in South Florida, is if I was having dinner with my wife and got a phone call, and I wouldn't answer. But if it was urgent, I would ask the members, if you call me twice quickly, I will answer the second time. Otherwise, leave me a voicemail on the first call, and I will get back to you after dinner. That was a way of saying I'm available almost all the time, but there are occasions where family priorities would say, do not answer the phone every time it rings. But generally speaking, again, even here at headquarters, the door's cracked. That means that I'm interruptible.
Right.
And I think that's a good way of putting it. Whatever you're doing, and so much of life is whatever you're doing at the moment. You get interrupted, and you learn to, when that's over and interruption's completed, get back to what you were doing. So I call it being interrupt driven.
Yes.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. That Mr. Weston mentioned in his sermon, was some time ago, talking about serving other people. He said that really the times that come up when your service is, when our service is really needed and matters, is almost always inconvenient.
Yes.
That's just the way a service position is, and your brother isn't usually going to need you at a time when, this is great, I'm literally sitting here wishing someone needed me for something. It's usually going to be when you have something else to do. So, and giving your members a way to indicate to you, like, he might be at dinner, I'll ring it twice. I think that actually is very interesting.
Well, one of our questions, since you kind of are in that area anyway already, Mr. Smith, was a question further down that was talking about your being available, and we have to be generic here, of course, but I already know, some of the examples here in Charlotte the last 5 years of people having tragedy in their life, and we'll just leave it at that, or an illness, and they suddenly have to go to the hospital, and you're driving up to the hospital, or sometimes it seems like you're just there with the family, not to solve a problem, but you're there as support, and knowing that you're available. This is kind of what we talked about already. I mean, I had an incident in my family not that long ago that you offered to go with me and to talk about something, and I really appreciated that, and just your presence and being there meant a lot to me. I wondered if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on, what is exactly the question? In your experience of having to be around people, what kind of toll does it take on you, and how do you feel it means to families that as the minister, you're there and ready to help them?
Well, I think that the membership in general has an appreciation for their pastor, for the ministry. However, on day-to-day activities and let's say church activities, and they're around you, but being available when someone's really needed. An example, but having an injury from a car accident, and you get a call that says that my husband has been hurt, and he's at the hospital, and they're not there. But you go to the hospital and you meet them, and in the middle of the emergency, sometimes there is a chance to pull the curtain and anoint the individual that's been hurt. But a lot of times it's simply sitting in the room or standing in the ER room, and the member saying to the doctor, "Well, this is my pastor, and I'm not there to give any medical advice. I'm simply there to give some assurance that someone's available. Maybe a family member's not even there yet." And there is I think all of us understand this, that when we're in a dire situation of some sort, it's nice to have someone present that can handle whatever conversations or questions that might come up, and not know all of it, and to share with the doctor or whatever. But hospital visits are not uncommon, and ER visits. And I had one just this past weekend. I think it's 2 weekends ago, that you get a call that they're at the ER, and you go, and there's not a thing you can do when you're there. But I anointed the gentleman, and he said, "Well, let's you can go home now," because it was late. It was late, about 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night. And actually, I said, "No, I can stay for a few minutes," and it appeared to be of benefit to stay there and just talk about other things.
Yes.
That distracted the matter to a degree, waiting for the doctors to figure out what could or should be done.
You know, my limited experience with going down to the hospital in the manner you're speaking of, my anecdotal experience said that the nurses were actually fairly sympathetic to a pastor being there. Can you tell the difference between reactions from the doctor versus the nurses?
Yeah, I think it's. I would say, but people talk about doctors have a calling, but I think nurses, those that whether it be nurses or even the attendants, there is a certain air about them. They do have a different emotion about them, and trying to put the patient at ease. The doctors are usually their bedside manners sometimes is questionable. Frankly, I can't recall any nurse, male or female, having a bad bedside manner. They're there trying to make you, treating you. They're still trying to make it easy on you. The doctors are there for information. We need to do this, need to do that, and we're doing this. Thank you. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Yeah, they're often seeing so many. It really is kind of a hit and run sort of thing. But kind of what you mentioned, I have found that hospital staff in general seem, I don't want to say pro ministry, but they seem to recognize that's a real part of not only your job, but their patients' care and life. And I've often wondered if push came to shove, if somehow they would say, "Look, we just think you're a quack, but we try to be nice." But a lot of them, I think they've seen the benefit for families, that they have there. But I'd actually never thought about whether it's different with doctors versus nurses. Now, you mentioned South Florida a while ago, and it's going to sound really, really dumb to me, but I don't know, coming from Texas, you just hear, Texas is a big state and all the other states are tiny and they're really little bitty. But Florida is a long state. It is a really,
Yes.
it's really long. It's not very wide, but it's very long. When you were there, did that occasion a need to have to drive a bit, or were you blessed with kind of a highly concentrated sort of area? What was that like?
Well, when you say South Florida, you're really talking about, let's say, just north of Orlando, south.
Okay.
All the way to the tip. So I had Fort Lauderdale congregation and had what was called the Tampa congregation initially. We started the congregation in Melbourne. So there were three from Fort Lauderdale to Tampa on the Sabbath. Driving over there was a little over 3 hours. And then a lot of times what we'd do is we'd stay over Saturday night, and Sunday would visit there. Then Sunday after evening we'd drive down the West Coast to Naples, So yeah, but there was a fair amount of driving. I'd say probably every third week we would spend in Tampa and drive south and go along the West Coast. So Florida's not only long in terms of north to south, but I remember moving from Texas to Florida. And when I got to the Florida border, I thought, I'm almost there. I'm almost to Fort Lauderdale. Well, no, I got and driving from the border all the way over to 95 was a better part of a day, and then another day to get to Fort Lauderdale. So it was there was it's wide at the top and narrow at the bottom, but long. So yes,
So we went to the feast in Destin Beach a few years ago, and I was excited to be back in Florida again. And I told my wife, because one of my lifelong dreams that has not come to pass is getting all the way down to the Florida Keys and maybe getting down to Key West. And so we're there in Destin Beach, and I tell Audrey excited, I was like, maybe we could drive down to the Florida Keys. And she gave me that look that she doesn't give that often, like, are you being serious right now? Which I was being serious. And we mapped it, and it was like 12 hours, something like that.
Yeah, we've done it. We've driven to the Keys, and I knew it would be a long trip, but it wasn't until we got there I realized this was an incredibly long trip. Yeah, it was very far.
I remember one of the things, I really am a little fuzzy on this, so maybe, hopefully I can ask this question in a way that will make sense. I remember when we would visit you guys in West Palm, and you would talk about your circuits or just how you would organize your driving time, because as we've established, it's not inconsiderable driving times. I want to say you, especially when you would go to Tampa, that you had to be kind of strategic about it, and then you would often stay over and then do a club, and maybe even sometimes stay longer maybe on Sundays and do visiting and things like that. I remember being really impressed with, it wasn't a matter of just driving around giving sermons again, which is kind of the point of this whole topic. You were very strategic about how you did it, and you bundled things together to be the most efficient you could with your time. Is that, am I characterizing that correctly?
Yes, I would say it was the exception in going to Tampa, which was, again, it was a little over a 3-hour drive to get to services from our house. So we would quite often spend the night, simply because since you spent 3 hours on the road, rather than spend 3 hours going back home that evening, to stay overnight and visit. But I know for a while there, I was going through, I'd said several men that we would do some training for giving sermonettes, and we'd meet once a month and do the training on sermonettes and song leading. Spokesman club. We had enough men to have that and do that at certain times of the year, not in the summertime, and have that on Saturday night. So yes, and then scheduling visiting, though, going down the West Coast. Generally do that at least, I'd say every other month. Would spend maybe 3 days. Would go to Sabbath service in Tampa, drive down to and visit around there at that whole area. On Sunday, drive halfway to Naples and would make visits. Get to Naples, visit, then drive back home on Tuesday. So it'd be basically a 3-day trip.
You know, one of the things that when Mr. Senna started giving me, like showing me the ministerial experience, but also like asking me to do small things. And one of the things, I say small, you'll laugh, doing the schedule, speaking schedule. Okay. And so he had Houston, Temple, Austin, Corpus, and San Antonio was kind of thrown in there, but it was not a stable congregation. I mean, just meant we didn't have enough members. And so he had me do it. And you start scheduling 5 different areas and trying to keep it in. You have to be aware of other people's schedules and what's going on in their life and things like that. And I was struck by how difficult it was to fill out just a speaking schedule, let alone the larger logistics of running a church area. And then, of course, I know Charlotte, which is a unique challenge on the schedule. There's like 700 ministers that you need to schedule. And just trying to do a schedule for 3 months, I know, is very taxing. Maybe we don't have to like emphasize the Charlotte challenge, but what it takes to organize a church area, and I don't mean just the speaking schedule. I had a lot of experience with the way Mr. Gary Stein ran things in Texas, and he always amazed me about how he was always up and going somewhere and taking care of things, and just the scheduling of the areas was a big deal. What could you tell our audience about some of the challenges, not just the speaking schedule, but your church picnics you're trying to organize in there, and maybe it's time to get your deacons and elders together for a meeting to talk to them about how you're going to serve the congregations, things like that.
Well, that's let's say three congregations, which is what I had at the latter half of South Florida. It's not just speaking schedule. I was blessed with, let's say, quite a staff. I think in Fort Lauderdale, for example, we had 6 deacons.
Oh, that's nice.
And we had two elders that as well. But you're literally assigning the sermonette men and the sermon, but song leaders as well, and any activities. And usually for all 3 congregations, a couple of activities a year. Major activities that would have to be organized, and so that part of it comes into play. But one of the other things that you have to cope with is where people meet. Where our congregations meet, and for the most part, you could get it at a facility that you say most of the year you could use. But there's always the one-off, and there's like holy days in the middle of the week. You can't use where you meet on the Sabbath. You may not be able to meet during the week. So the holy days come in to play. Scheduling where are you going to have an activity, and then which men are you going to use for various activities, and their schedules again. So it's very time-consuming, and it's. I would do them in Florida, I would do them for 2 months at a time, and usually there were multiple iterations or changes as you went down. Now at headquarters, even more so, because I do them at 3 months, and there are a number of ministers whose schedules are not fixed, and so setting it in place one time doesn't mean it's going to stay that way for 3 months. It's going to change multiple times.
Yes, I remember that. And one other thing I'd forgotten about, I'm glad you mentioned it, because briefly I was tasked, we were having trouble finding a reliable hall up in the Round Rock, North Austin area, and I thought it can't be that hard to find a place. And I was so wrong, because, like if you're those like, what are those all called? Quality Inn or something, and they have a little meeting hall. Well, they actually don't like to commit to you having it all month, because if somebody wants to come and have a wedding, that's far more profitable to them. And then a facility that you could get regularly was often more expensive than what the guidelines are for getting it. And I was stunned with how difficult it was to find a suitable hall that you could rely on.
Yeah, it was nice. I know I had the help of key deacons in the area that knew the area, and I probably leaned on them way more heavily than I should have. But it was grateful to have guys like that knew the area and could find things here or there. One of the things that we wanted to mention is, I remember before I was in the ministry, or especially before I was behind the lectern at all. Before I was behind my wife and I lovingly sort of called that time the bubble. No one cared about what you thought about anything. No one, you didn't really share much. And then you're behind the lectern. Well, now people do want to, it's like they got a different idea of doctrine or this or that, let alone then when you're in the ministry and you're really, it's not a matter of being above. It is a matter of being visible. And next thing you know, people, especially then I started coordinating feasts. And next thing I know, I remember there was a time when a fella who I don't think he's alive anymore. I'm not sure, but he might be. But this one fella wanted to attend. He doesn't attend with us, and had sent an email. And I asked him. I said, "Oh, well, hey, I was talking with him, but he come to find out. You look at his website. He hates us. I mean, he just really says all these nasty things. But he wanted to attend our feast site. And so I said, well, no, I mean, I don't know. I don't even understand why you'd want to. You're here calling us idolaters. I mean, just the worst things. Well, anyway, then I get a contact from another person in the church who reaches out to me about a friend they want to have coming, and it was just I can't remember because I think I was at the time for that feast site I was actually coordinating rooms and somehow the fella I can't remember why they even need to reach out, but I'm so glad they did because it ended up being the same guy. He just was trying to go. Well, the guy also had a website. That's how I knew that he hated us because I looked on his website and so now I'm a star of his website. He's writing about nasty Wally Smith. He's so terrible, and that was a little new for me. But of course, being on the telecast, it's starting to pile up. You start to see it. But that said, yeah, you next thing you know, you kind of can run from being the nicest guy in the world to slings and arrows is the way Mr. Robinson has put it with that. Well, has that been a bit? That's what I want to ask about the kind of burden that might have been.
You find yourself in a situation where you're maybe being attacked very unfairly, but there's not much you can really do about it. Like you can't fight back in a worldly sense. How challenging has it been for you to deal with hostile people that are maybe even just not very cooperative?
Or go-tos or something, right.
Well, it's a couple of experiences. Sometimes it's not even in person. It's on the phone. That had a very pleasant call from a gentleman who was very excited about everything we teach, everything he had read, and when he wanted to come to church, and I gave him the address and the time and all that, and we go on talking, and he asks questions, and he mentions the Trinity. Well, excuse me, Mr. Brown, whatever his name was, we should talk about that because we don't teach the Trinity. At which point, he went off like a rocket because that is such a standard belief, but the professing Christian communities that probably 95% of them believe in the Trinity, and after a couple of minutes of me listening, I interrupted and just please understand we just don't teach that. And all I heard was a click.
Wow.
He hung up on me, and had a wedding a number of years ago. A young lady and a young man, members of the church, and we have the wedding. And after the wedding, the grandmother of the girl comes up and says, "That's the worst wedding ceremony I have ever heard in my life." And I was like, "Well, I'm so sorry,
I'll let CAD know.
It was too serious. It was not enough about love and emotion, and so there's some arrows that come your way, but I think that it's not that often, thankfully.
Yes. One of the things, again, when working with Mr. Senna, that I found out, this was another thing that really, it's not like I had any kind of really strongly held position, but I had kind of a default assumption. Maybe that's the best way of putting it. And I realized pretty quickly, as Mr. Senna would share with me, some things are going on. He was always very good about being confidential, so don't take it the wrong way. But you quickly find out that the minister is one of the only people that tends to have both sides of a story. That when you see the minister maybe make a decision or he's doing something a certain way, and it's just so puzzling to you, like, why are they doing that? In fact, you may even think that the minister is handling it incorrectly. But over time, I quickly realized almost nobody has the full story and the full understanding, and that the minister tended to have, or not even tended, almost always had more information, and so there were factors going on that the minister cannot possibly share because of confidential reasons, and is doing the best he can to handle the situation. But it doesn't look like it's, from the outside looking in, it doesn't look like it's fair or
well. Hopefully, you have somebody who understands to a degree. But I had one serious occasion quite a while ago, but. They had to make a decision and had to actually announce the decision to the congregation. And what came to me after the fact was one mate said to the other one, "Ooh, does Mr. Strain realize what he's doing?" and the other mate's response was, "Well, I think Mr. Strain probably would have checked with headquarters on that. So he probably has the backing of the church in general that recognize that sometimes the decisions have to be made and there are no details.
Right.
You simply announce it, and it's rare, frankly, of that nature. But there are some people who understand that there are reasons for what would be, let's say, dramatic or impactful decisions about some things.
This came up kind of on one of our recent podcasts. We were talking about what you can do in the work today. And one of those things we mentioned in that one is just supporting your local minister here and there. And, the situation you just mentioned where the fellow said to his spouse, well, he's probably talking, kind of assuming the best, kind of filling in the gaps in that way. I would say, sometimes if someone comes up and they don't know the details and they're not necessarily looking to ask about the details, but they still recognize, I bet that was difficult. And just to come up and say, hey, just so you know, praying for you. I know that was probably really difficult. I don't know the details, but a little support like that really is helpful.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I realized, that part of the job of being a minister was that you'll occasionally have to make an unpopular decision or take an unpopular stance. But then I also came to understand that there are always good reasons for that. But you're not in a position to explain your decisions sometimes because of just...
Well, there's a variation, I think, is one of the circus guys made a comment. You can fool some of the people all the time, and you can fool all the people some of the time, but you can't fool them all the time. Mm-hmm. Well, you just change the word from fool to please. You can please some of the people all the time, and you can please all of them some of the time, but you can't please them all the time. There are things that decisions have to be made, and usually after the pastor is there for a considerable time and wins, if you will, the confidence of the congregation, those things are, I think, the exception certainly to the rule. That those things come up like that.
Yeah, I didn't realize, Mr. Gwynn knew, of course, back in Dallas area, that headquarters was thinking of asking me to be in the ministry, but they did give me a job. I wasn't a deacon. I didn't have, but they did. He and the local deacon talked to me because they wanted me to take care of the hall, to start taking care of the hall, which included air conditioning, comfort levels, if you will. And now what I know now is that he knew they were looking at, recommending me for the ministry. And so this was probably let's see what Wally does with this. But that was one of the things that I learned pretty quickly, is just realizing when it comes to just mere air temperature, there is no way I will humanly get every person in this room comfortable. But it was still fun trying to, do you recommend sitting here? Well, I don't really want to sit there because of this. You kind of recommend what you can. But that was one of the great lessons from that. It was like, and you always feel like you know those things. I know those things. But until you're actively trying to deal with people, it comes home in a different way.
I remember teaching my daughters when they were young. So the following statement, just so everybody knows, isn't implying that this is fair. Sometimes you just have to deal with reality. And I told them the reality is the thermostat is controlled by men at church. Okay, bring a sweater.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it was difficult too. I'd ask Janine, is it too hot or too cold? She goes, honey, don't ask me. My thermostat's all messed up. I won't know. So,
well, that's temperature-wise. Obviously, that is a matter of concern at headquarters. And so even in the wintertime, the standard treatment is for the ladies to bring a blanket in case they need it.
Yes. Well, so that's interesting. I was thinking that this might actually be a blessing for you, but now I realize it's probably not, which is in Charlotte, we do not control the thermostat. The school does, the school district.
Oh, yeah.
But that doesn't mean people won't complain about it.
Yeah, in a sense, it could be a blessing. Like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. But then it's a curse because you can't do anything about it. I know my wife will actually prepare. She feels it seems so crazy, but it'll be summer, and she'll still bring like potentially a blanket or coat because then sometimes they run up the air conditioner, and that makes it that much colder. Well, we really should be wrapping up, and I don't think this question was brought up to you because we try to make it plain to our viewers. We do discuss these things a bit we don't want to spring everything on our poor guest, so we try to give them a sense of where we're going with all this. Though they often, can be surprising. But in this particular case, this was not shared with you, but it was a thought that I had. And if there's no good answer to it, that's just fine. In fact, we'll delete it from this. No one will ever know. But those of you listening may not realize that headquarters is a place where they often send trainees now. They'll people that we're going to be sending into the field, they'll send them here to headquarters so they have a chance to work with Mr. Strain and to get experience in that regard. And it's been wonderful, actually, to see that happen and to see Mr. Strain, people be able to work with you. But what I haven't thought about is going from the perspective of being a pastor, but then now being a pastor who is working with future pastors. I know this is going to sound strange, but I think it's connected. When I was a mathematician, when I was getting my degree, that was one thing. But then suddenly when I'm teaching math, to other people, the same things I had learned, I just thought about so many things differently. And so I'm just really curious in terms of your experience now having to train so many of these guys coming through. Has there been any kind of revelation to you? Has there been any sort of aha moment like, oh boy, now that I'm having to explain this to someone else, something's really clear? Or has it all been like, nah, it's been a piece of cake, not a challenge at all?
Well, I think I can relate something that Mr. Meredith said when I was in college, because he was our freshman Bible teacher. I had him 67, 68. He just talking to the men, and I don't think it was in the first year Bible class. I think it was actually in one of the speech lectures. He said, "Now you fellas think being a minister is all fun and exciting." He said, "You have no idea what's involved." And I liked Mr. Robinson's analogy earlier about the iceberg. Because I think probably giving a sermon, a part of the job, and things related to it, it probably is 10%. There's a lot more that goes into it. And so Mr. Miller said, you all think it's all fun and glory to be up here giving the sermon and speaking, but you don't realize that there's a lot more to it. And other experiences I had, that in every job, now if I can use the term job of being a minister, but in every vocation, there is something called grunt work, and there are parts of it you really enjoy, and I think for most ministers, after we get to experience, we enjoy giving a sermon. Now, what you don't see is what happens on Thursday night and Friday night, and the sweat that comes into doing something, and even in Texas, when I worked with Mr. Hall, and he was the pastor, and I was actually speaking in 3 congregations once a month in each of those 3. And on Friday night, one time, the trash bag can was half full of crumpled papers because of ideas that simply did not work. And Mr. Hall called me about something else late that night. It must have been 10 o'clock at night, and I said, after we talked, I said, "Now, can I tell you why the real reason you called me?" And he said, "What do you mean?" I called you because of that. I said, "No, the real reason you called me was I have a sermon tomorrow, and I have no idea what I'm going to talk about." And it was 10 o'clock at night. And I said, "So before you go to sleep, would you pray for me?" And 30 minutes later, I had the germ of an idea. Now, I was up till about 3 o'clock getting the sermon ready, but this whole idea of the stress of the moment, those things come out. And so giving the sermon obviously is a big deal. But in my 11 years now, since counting Florida and headquarters, in 11 years, is that right? 13 years, I have been the coordinator for 6 feast sites. So that's a significant amount of work that's above and beyond pastoring churches. You have TWPs have to be worked on and taken care of. There's a plethora of other duties that come into place. There's administrative functions, reports, schedules, all those things that are part of that 90% of the iceberg that's under the water. And so Mr. Meredith was correct. We had no idea, because what we saw was the sermon, and we thought and those things don't just fall in your lap. Frankly, they take at any given time. There may be you have ideas, but sometimes the ideas are not have germinated yet, and there's a lot of work that goes into that as well. But the iceberg does have a lot of things you don't see normally.
Wow. It reminds me of a comment one of my math professors said, because we were majoring, I was there majoring in math, and you didn't major in math to do number crunching, right? Back then, when you're at that point, it's all symbols and it's all so fancy. But he was doing a problem on the board and he's teaching us something, and we had to do suddenly a lot of just plain old arithmetic, just a lot of number crunching. And he turned to us, this was a wonderful guy, and he said, I know number crunching is not why you became mathematicians, but mowing the parish lawn is not why the parish priest became the priest, but the parish priest's lawn still has to mow his lawn. That is, still has to mow the lawn. And so this we got to mow the lawn. And so that was my first insight to realize, well, you mean jobs aren't always everything you love about them all the time? So anyway, thank you very much. We really appreciate it, Mr. Strain. We know that you just spent all this time talking about what a busy guy you are, and then you're willing to come in and spend. And actually, our audience has no idea. I don't think it's been the same amount of time trying to set up, but we just had so many technical difficulties in terms of trying to get this together. And Mr. Strain just had a beautiful patience that all of us here in the congregation helped to encourage him to have with all of our questions. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience with us. And hey, we'll keep praying for you. Thank you for pastoring us.
Yeah. Well, you're very welcome, and I've enjoyed it.
Smith and Robinson.